So that all looks good.
Perfect.
All right.
Wonderful.
Fantastic. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel for another episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. This is episode 8, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to be here today with none other than Raf Blutaxt. So, Raf, how are you today? And thank you so much for coming.
Hello, Philip. I'm extremely excited to be here. That is like something that I've like really wanted to be on your channel for a while, and I'm, to finally actually be there is great for me. So I'm good, even though I'm a bit tired because I live the rock and roll life.
You told me before we started recording what you were up to the last couple of days, and I have to say you have my complete admiration for keeping that schedule.
Yeah, it's all about the rock and roll things. Like, I slept like 3 hours over the last night, and
wow.
Traveled about like it's not that far. It's like 400 or 500 kilometers in each direction. So that's what I did. But I spent all that time listening to audiobooks on the train. So I was good there.
Well, you made good use of the travel time too. Well, and of course, music is a huge part of your life. So
it's very much, it's probably like the largest part there, together with like the fantasy books and stuff, or like general books and stuff. It's like music, basically. I did bring myself a beer because it's awesome. 7 in the afternoon, and well, to be fair, I've been drinking a few because we're having a barbecue on our balcony with my old flatmate and my current flatmate.
Oh, and, nice.
Yeah, it's how we fight back against capitalism on 1st of May in Germany is by annoying the neighbors with propaganda and drinking beer. Apparently,
it's Labor Day.
It's Labor Day, yes, and we might break out the mead that I made last year later on because it tends to happen in these situations.
Nice. So the mead is ripe now. It's ready to go.
The mead has been ripe for a while. I've been drinking off it, but I made 60 liters of this stuff because I made 30 liters, and unfortunately the video that I was making at the time, there was like a technical error with the camera, so the video didn't work.
I remember that, and it was very
so what I did, because I'm a stubborn person, is like I got myself a new barrel, and then I made another 30 liters of mead.
That's awesome. So you had double the amount you expected.
I had double the amount I expected, and about 40 liters of those 60 liters are gone by now, and I have gotten myself another large pot of honey. Nice. So there will be new mead very soon.
You and Winnie the Pooh both like the large pots of honey, right?
It is the best novel that was ever written. It is the perfect novel, Winnie the Pooh, and I will always stand by that claim.
I will not argue with that. It's something that is near and dear in my household. I read that to my daughters when they were little. Winnie the Pooh is just absolutely, probably certainly for my older daughter, it was like the central story of her childhood. So
but it really works as well when you're reading it as an adult, right? It's like,
oh yeah,
it was the first book I read in English. It's something I go back to every year a couple of times because it's just so good, and there's so much in there.
Yeah. Well, anyway, you want to open that bottle?
I can certainly open that beer.
All right. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
All right. Very nice. Okay. Well, yours tastes better than mine. I'm just drinking water.
Well, this is my usual go-to because it's the one they sell near where I live. So it's an unfiltered what we in Germany call Keller beer, a cellar beer, because it's an unfiltered beer.
Nice. Very nice. So I do want to talk more with you about your music because that's a big part of who you are. But I also think it'd be good for you to, for those of my viewers who may not know your channel, let's start out by having you describe what you do on your channel and what you want to go, where you want to go with it, what you see yourself doing with it in the near future. So whatever you want to say about your channel, just go for it.
Wonderful. I do ramble about books, and it's all very rambling. I started by accident, and then I did like what I usually do these days. is these like read along vlogs where I read a book and then I talk about my thoughts and like associations and stuff that I connect with it and all of that. It's like very free form. And then from time to time, I have like more organized videos about more general topics and stuff. And I went through all of Malazan last year, except the novellas that I can't get on audio. But all of
the
the
Bocaline
rest,
and Corbel Brooch are not on audiobook?
they're not on Audible or in any other audiobook form that I know. And
okay.
I guess that's like one of the things I should tell. It's like I'm blind and I have to live with audiobooks because or text to speech, which is really horrible because my braille capabilities are unfortunately not very good. I'm even bad at being blind. It's
well, oh dear. Well, that's a good thing to mention. And of course, a lot of my viewers are audiobook listeners as well. I'm not. I have never actually used an audiobook. And I know that there are a lot of great performances on audiobooks, and there are certain series that have been recommended to me. So that's something I want to ask you about. What would you recommend for me? And it could be series that I've read already. For example, I've heard the Joe Abercrombie First Law books have a great narrator.
Yeah, a lot of people like Stephen Pacey. I think a lot of people like him. I think the one that always comes up is Dresden Files.
Yep.
And I would say Dresden Files works really well because it's a first-person narrative in general, and it's read by James Masters, who played Spike in the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series.
Okay.
And he really performs he becomes Harry Dresden when reading it, and that's something that you obviously can get works much better with like a first-person narrative, right? So that one is certainly something that even though I have a lot of problems with the Dresden Files series, the books, the narration in the audiobooks is phenomenal. It's really, really good.
Okay.
And beyond that, I'm not that much of a person who like, I know there's people I was like, this is a great narrator or whatever, but for me, it's like, it's the only option I have to get a book. So I'll take it and I will not complain about any form of narration.
Okay. Cool. So First Law, Dresden Files. How are the Malazan narrators? How would you...
The Malazan Book of the Fall, it's interesting. So the first Malazan Book of the Fallen novels, first 3, are narrated by one person, and then they switch narrator.
Okay.
And I personally like the voice of the first one of Ralph Lister more than the one of, oh God, I keep forgetting his name, Michael Page. That's the guy. Okay. He also narrated. This is one of those funny things, right? A lot of people like him in Malazan, and he narrated a bunch of First Law books, the standalone novels, for the audiobook first. And people who enjoyed Stephen Pacey's narration of the first trilogy complained so much that they did like a re-recording with Stephen Pacey. But I still have, I still own the version of The Heroes, and I think Best Served Cold, both read by Michael Page and not by Stephen Pacey.
Interesting.
So a lot of that is like very, personal, whatever. And like, I think the first time I encountered Michael Page was him reading the Scott Lynch, A Gentleman Bastard series.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay.
And I guess the problem or like a difficulty there is that if you read, if you connect one specific narrator with a specific series of books or specific characters, it can be kind of jarring when you encounter the same voice somewhere else, because the voice is always more personal than just like typeface on a page or something, right?
Interesting. Yeah, I never thought of that, but that makes perfect sense. Yeah, that you would associate a particular voice with the world of the novels that the narrator's reading for. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
I guess another one that I really recommend, although I don't know how easy it is to get them because I bought them on CD back in the day, and I don't think they're available on Audible, but there is a complete recording of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, all 5 original novels, all read by Douglas Adams himself. And unlike some other authors, he's a very good performer when it comes to telling his own story.
Yeah, you know who else?
That one's really good.
I think Neil Gaiman is another one who reads.
Neil Gaiman is also very good. Stephen King reads some of his own books.
Is that right?
But I'm not a huge Stephen King fan to start with, and he has a
Uh-huh.
like for me a very bland voice.
Huh. Yeah, I of course I'd have to listen, but I wouldn't have thought that his voice would necessarily be that pleasant to listen to for a long time. But
Yeah. But Neil Gaiman does a very good job, and he reads some of his own books. I think Stardust definitely, and Ocean at the End of the Lane is the one that I have read that he narrates himself.
that's a lovely.
American God is someone else, as far as I know. I mean, maybe there's one that he reads that I don't know, but the one that I have listened to was performed by someone else.
Yeah, and he has a very smooth voice.
Yeah, he's a smooth talker.
Yeah. I almost met him once.
Yeah.
At a it was actually a party for the the place where my literary agent works. So it's a literary agency that had been around for, I think it was their 40th anniversary. This was
Okay.
quite a few years ago. And Neil Gaiman is one of their clients.
Okay.
They had a bunch of famous people there, and you could always tell there were groups of people gathered around each of the most like famous authors. So I was still a very new guy. I didn't know anyone there except for my agent, and he was very busy talking to all kinds of people. So
Yeah.
I didn't really have. I did find another sort of guy like me who was not I think he was also not published yet, and so we were just sort of like hanging out, a little starstruck, and I wanted to talk to Neil Gaiman because I've actually taught his book American Gods in my fantasy novels class. I've read it quite a few times, and it teaches really well. It's a really good fantasy novel to teach. Because it's
I think it lends itself to teach, I guess, especially in an American context, because of like Neil Gaiman's perspective, because he's not an American, right? He's British, like Welsh,
exactly.
I guess,
something
like that.
Yeah,
he's British, but I think he's from Wales originally, something like that. So he has an outsider's perspective, and him like trying to find out what makes America American in a way, and doing it through the lens of those like foreign, or not foreign, but older European, or not even only European, but like former gods that came with the people that came to America. It's a very good concept, and I think you can teach a lot about it, like, and go into all kinds of like aspects, what literature can do, what fantasy can do by providing these lenses on specific things.
Absolutely right. You nailed it. That's exactly why it teaches really well. It's very theme laden. And I like the story. I know it's a little disjointed. It is sort of part fantasy and part road trip and part mystery and all of that. And some people don't feel like it all meshes together that well, but I really like what he does there.
I didn't like it. And I think, the road trip is the quintessential American novel in a way. It's like, there's no genre that is more American than the road trip. Maybe the Western, but I guess the road trip is the thing. It's like, you don't do road trips in Europe because we're all bunched together so closely.
You get on a train. You have public transportation over there.
That's true. It's like I get on a train. I'll do this next weekend. I'm going to a festival that some friends organize in Brittany, like on the Atlantic coast in France, and I'll go there by train. It's like 2 trains. I go one train to Paris, and one train from Paris to the Atlantic coast, and I don't think that's possible in the US.
No, it's really not. I happen to live in one of the few areas where there is some public transportation because I'm not very far from New York City.
Yeah.
But most of it is very much like the trains all go into New York and out of New York. You can't go from one part of New Jersey to another on public transport. You have to go into New York and then out, in order to do that.
Yeah, that's like a fascinating thing in the US with trains, right? It's like the railroad is that big theme in all of like the Western literature and like Western stories, Western movies, in like the steam engine, the steam train is the symbol for like the 19th century in the US, and then you just like drop the ball on the whole public transport
what happened
thing.
was the 1950s happened, and there was actually it was a very deliberate choice, and there was a very powerful automobile lobby that essentially I don't want to use the word bribe, but essentially convinced our politicians
Yeah.
that we would, instead of having a public transportation network with railroads and such, that we would invest in highways. And so really that's when it was, we were fully committed to. And that's when, after that, you get the road trip novels. So no coincidence there, you know.
Yeah, I mean, as a German, I can tell you that, like, if people desire to build highways or autobahns, it's usually a bad sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although our road trips usually end up in, Poland or Russia, and that's not like where you want to go.
Yeah, well, I've driven on your autobahns before, and it was somewhat terrifying experience, I confess.
Yeah, because we have like no speed limit. You can drive like as fast as your car goes.
Yeah, so I'm somebody who normally I drive about the speed limit here, which is usually like 65. So I might sneak like 5 miles per hour over. So I'll go 70. And I was white knuckled and driving as fast as I dared. I think I got up to like maybe 95 on the Autobahn, which of course all the cars were zipping by me. I was still the slow one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I remember like when we organized a festival, and a friend of mine was driving bands from Frankfurt Airport to where I live, where we had the festival. And he had a band from England, and they obviously also have like a speed limit of like 60 miles or something. And he was driving super fast because, time was like really short and everything. And he was like driving like 220, 230 kilometers per hour. And the guy was leaning over and looking at the speedometer. I was like, how much is that in miles? And trying to calculate. It's like, I guess it's around 120 miles. And the guy's like, that's like double the speed we're allowed to do.
Wow. Yeah. I'm not going to be a race car driver anytime soon. That's for sure. But I love Germany. I don't know if I ever told you, I lived there when I was a boy.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't know.
Yeah.
Where?
So my father was in the army, and we were stationed in a little place called Bad Hersfeld, and that is in Hessen.
That's like 50 kilometers from where I live.
Oh, is that right? Wow, that's awesome. Yeah. So back then there was a big wall. It was in the 1970s that I was.
Yeah, of course. Bad Hersfeld is fairly close to like the former GDR border.
Yep. It is. We were actually very close to the Iron Curtain. Yeah. And we had all these silly things like nuclear Holocaust drills in school. They would have us hide under the desks, like that was going to help, right?
Have you ever watched the cartoon, not cartoon, but animated movie from like the 80s where the Wild Wind Blows?
That's very familiar, and maybe I have, but
this couple that does prepare for exactly the nuclear holocaust, like building their own bomb shelter in their house with like taking the door out and putting in the right angle so they can hide behind it, and they do all of that, and it works out. They survive the actual bombing, and then they just like die of like radiation poisoning because it's not a happy.
That sounds very familiar. I might have actually seen that and blocked it from my memory.
It's that time when suddenly people decided to make cartoon movies that are like for grown-ups. Stuff like a Watership Down, which is so much not a children's movie and gave me nightmares as a kid.
But I did see that one. I remember that one very well, and being sort of traumatized by it. Absolutely. But yeah, the other place I lived was Augsburg.
Yeah, that's near Munich. Now,
very near Munich. Yeah,
I've passed through that. Like I live in Marburg, which is very close to Bad Hersfeld.
Yep. Yes, indeed. Wow. Yeah. So, and Augsburg, I was there in the 80s until mid 80s.
Nice.
The sad thing about that experience, and I'm so glad that I lived in Germany. And we did travel outside of the army fort, but there wasn't a lot. There could have been a lot more, I think, interaction. I did happen to live when we were in Augsburg on the very edge of the fort. And there was nothing stopping me from wandering into German parts of Augsburg. Yeah. And so I did, and I had German friends. And it was great, it was wonderful. But there wasn't a lot of encouragement to have a lot of cultural interaction. We didn't. I did take German, but they didn't really teach it very well. So I didn't really learn German until I was in college, and there I read it much better than I speak it. So
to be fair, the English I got taught in school didn't help me much either.
yeah.
It's all audiobooks and hanging out with mostly Australians at heavy metal festivals that like
cool.
gave me the the grasp of English that I have these days.
Well, that's a great way to learn. Absolutely. So,
yeah.
Well, so let's talk about that then, since you brought up the music again, and how that's I want to talk about your sort of literary journey too, which is sort of more relevant to your BookTube channel. But I also find this music part of you to be very interesting, because you are actually involved. You have your own label, right? This is something that this is like not just a passion, but it's also kind of your bread and butter, right?
Very, very stale bread and not much butter. I can tell you that. I kind of like ended up in that sort of by accident, because it's not exactly what I trained for, because no one trains for that, but you know. And I ended up with a record label, and I've booked some tours for bands, and I've organized concerts, and most of that just I stumbled into by accident. Basically, it's like I ended up booking tours for a band that I'm a huge fan of, and
cool.
then they wanted to do like another tour, and they had like a new record coming out, and the idea was like to press it in Europe, so when they do like a European tour, they wouldn't have to actually ship couple hundred CDs to Europe, which would cost tons in shipping money and taxes and all of that terrible stuff. So we're like, and I'm like, okay, I can help you there. I can sort this out, no problem. So I did, and then suddenly someone else was like, you know what? My other band is also releasing an album. Could you maybe do the same for us there? And then before I knew it, I had a label.
That is so cool. That's how you got into it. Wow. And what kind of music do you use, or do you just stick with one, or are you eclectic about it?
It is basically heavy metal, and it's mostly traditional heavy metal and what is called doom metal, so the more slower side with clean vocals, so no growling, almost no growling or screaming, which is like, for people that don't know much about heavy metal, usually like, oh, heavy metal is all that noise where people yell all the time. It's like, that's part of it, but that's not all of it.
Cool.
And with that, especially with like the epic metal and that kind of stuff, there is, which brings me back, right, there is a tight connection with a lot of fantasy literature. They have like a lot of fantasy themed songs. There's concept albums. Like one of the bands that I personally really like is the band called Cirith Ungol, which is already a name that is familiar. And ironically, they have always used the Michael Whelan Elric paperback covers as album covers. So there's a lot of like albino dudes with black swords on their album covers and stuff like that.
Wow.
Right, especially with someone like Michael Moorcock, the connection is obviously very close, because he used to do a lot of work with Hawkwind in the 70s, and do like poetry readings during their shows and stuff, and they wrote songs about like the Elric mythology, like the Eternal Champion and stuff like that. So the connection between the fantasy side and the rock music side has always been there, and is definitely something that has where those two parts of my interest connect and converge oftentimes.
That is a beautiful thing. That's really cool. I love that. So what are some then of the bands that you have worked with, and maybe what are some of your favorite bands as well?
I mean, so the band that kind of started all of this madness is a band called Mega Colossus from North Carolina. And they have a lot of songs about fantasy themes. They have like a bunch of songs about Dune, of course. Cool. Big Dune fan, the guys. They had songs about Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire long before the TV show started. So there's always been that fantasy connection there with those guys as well, which is one of the reasons why I'm vibing so well with those kind of people, right? there's all kinds of other bands like Purification. They're like a very anti-religious doom metal band from Portland.
Wow.
I have bands from all over the world. There's like a band called Votan. Oh, that's one for you. There's a band called Votan from Italy.
Yeah.
Votan from Italy, and their last album that I actually released, which was the first time I actually did vinyl, and what a mess it was, is a concept album, The Song of the Nibelungs, on the Nibelungenlied.
Oh, that's so cool. And they're from Italy though.
They're from like the north of Italy, so like from Lombardy. With a lot, which has a lot of like, you know, more like Germanic influences in that part. Like Lombardy is very Germanic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, that's cool. Wow. That's awesome. I love the fantasy connection with the music. I think you're so right. There tends to be some overlap there within those communities, I think.
Yeah. I think like one of the first like metal albums that I bought, like actual metal album outside of like, you know, stuff like Iron Maiden and Metallica, which is mainstream music at this point, obviously, was by a German band called Blind Guardian. And they've always had a Tolkien thing, and they have an album called Nightfall in Middle Earth, which is an entire concept album on the Silmarillion, because, you know, nerds, that they don't go in just for like a bit of Lord of the Rings, they go like Silmarillion.
Yeah, you gotta, if you're not a true Tolkien fan until you
exactly
really, you know, you've read the Silmarillion a few times. So.
It's like a 1 hour concept album on the fate of the Noldor in the Silmarillion.
Wow, that's high tragedy right there. Yeah.
It is.
Wow, that's awesome. Wow. So and I know Tolkien was or is a very formative storyteller for you and
definitely
for me as well. So I'd love to hear, this is something I usually do when I have a guest for Dear Dr. Fantasy, is that I ask about kind of your literary journey. So take us from, you know, little Raf all the way to the present day. What have been some of your most formative reads over your life, and how did you get here and be the person you are with the taste that you have today?
So yeah, Tolkien is definitely very formative. So after, you know, reading a lot of, you know, children's books, and then like what I read as a kid, there was like in Germany at least a couple of like publishers that did like abbreviated and because of their like translations, like in a more children friendly language, a lot of like classics, which came as a shock when I then went back and read those as an adult, and I found out that like Moby Dick is actually like 500 pages longer and has a lot of more a lot more dark stuff in there. So I read a lot of those classics in like children's versions as a kid, and then I remember like, so my mother is a Tolkien fan, and she read Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion and, you know, The Hobbit, the German versions, of course.
German translations. Are they pretty good in your opinion?
There's an older translation that is the one that I read first. That one is very good because the translator, she did an amazing job in trying to find German words even for, you know, the names and stuff. So, and there's a later translation, a newer translation that I personally am not that much a fan of. But at that point, I've already read the original, so I'm, you know, I have my own opinions on translation. But for example, Baggins is translated in the older version into Beutlin, which Beutel obviously is like a German word for a bag. So we keep the spirit of the place, of the name in a way, and turn it into a German word, because I mean, Tolkien, when he used the word Baggins, he obviously also meant he needed the connection to bag, because all of the Hobbit names, most of the Hobbit names are like, a lot of them are, you know, connected to other words like Baggins and what's it, proud feet, proud foots,
proud feet,
brace girdles, stuff like that, you know. So to keep that, and not just in like in the newer translation, he's just called Baggins, because at this point, I guess everyone, even in Germany, because of the movies and stuff, knows that the name's Baggins in English. So you just like keep it at this point. So I do appreciate that older translation, because he did a really good job. And a lot of German translations of English fantasy are not very good, because they're paid shit. Like, to be fair, a lot of like, with like what is not like absolute top tier, like top selling fantasy like Tolkien or Harry Potter, those not smaller but like genre fiction publishers, they just like pay a student like per page to translate that stuff, and that's what you get out of it. It's like,
oh really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's too bad. Yeah, because I feel like fantasy, well, we're getting off track. We can come back to this, but I would like to talk to you as well at some point about German fantasy, having read a little bit of it myself and being probably more familiar with some of the seminal older like medieval stuff like the Nibelungenlied and that sort of thing. But let's continue with your literary journey. So Tolkien was big.
So Tolkien was always there, but I never read it. And so here's the thing, is like I was like, I don't know, 10, 11 years old, and it's like I always saw those like Lord of the Rings books. I want to read that. My mom's like, you're not probably not old enough to actually read Lord of the Rings as a 10-year-old. I guess she might have been right. I don't know. And then I went on like a week-long like trip with like a sports team that I was in at the time. And good question with the sport, like, is it gymnastics, the whole thing, when you like actually do all the weird shit with you know, actual all these like what they call them,
like so the different when you're on the horse, or
exactly, those kind of things. So that's what I did as a kid, as a sport.
Gymnastics, we call that.
That was all gymnastics. So we went on like a week-long retreat with like the gymnastics group, a team that I was in at the time.
Cool.
And we had a bunch of books there, and someone actually had brought The Hobbit, so I read that while I was there on my gymnastics retreat. And then I came back like, now you got no chance to keep me from Lord of the Rings, because I already read The Hobbit.
Nice.
And then I read The Hobbit, and then I read then I read the Silmarillion, and I read those because I could still see more at the time. I read those as actual books in German, like my mom's books. The Silmarillion is in fact the last book that I ever read, because my eyesight was like declining at the time, and I never finished reading it. So I went through like most of the Noldor stuff, but I didn't get to like the Numenor part at the end of the Akallabeth. And at the time, my mother actually read those bits on tape and gave me those tapes so I could listen to them at the time. And that's why, like, part of why Tolkien is such a big influence for me, because there's a lot of like personal connection there.
There's a bond with your mother through
there's a bond with my mother there. There's that like, that's like the last thing I actually read, and in physical form, in a way. That there's a lot there with Tolkien that has stayed with me. On rereads, I'm very happy that on rereads Tolkien has proved to be, you know, rereadable and still meaningful and bring things, which is not something that goes for all of the stuff that I read as a kid.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Unfortunately. So that's that. And then for a while, because, you know, of me not having to come to terms with the fact when you're like 15 or whatever, and suddenly you can't do a lot of things anymore because you're suddenly blind. Well, not suddenly, but you know, you're suddenly too blind to do a lot of things. It kind of drove me away from reading for a while, because I didn't because like actually going and reading books or listening to audiobooks or whatever was always meant that I had to face the fact that I could no longer just like actually read a printed book. So it's like, and you know, when you're 15, facing problems is not the main thing to do. It's more about like ignoring them.
Oh yeah, and I was really good at that too when I was 15, although I was not dealing with blindness. But
but it's a general thing. When you're 15, you try to find ways to not face your problems.
Yep, this is true.
And then I kind of came back to reading fantasy. I obviously reread like Tolkien in English at the time, like listened to the audiobooks, and kind of went from there, read a lot, some science fiction. Then I left high school, went to university, and my flatmate at the time, we played D&D together, and my
Cool.
flatmate at the time read a lot of fantasy, and I read a lot of fantasy. So there was, which is the flatmate that's currently sitting up there and listening to anti-capitalist music and drinking beer. He's
Nice.
my that's the same guy. So we kind of shared books, and I think he read Gene Wolfe before I did, and I read
Oh,
Game of
wow.
Thrones before he did, and so we obviously exchanged those books. And then at the time, because we obviously had like a role-playing game group together as well, and I started like a book club with him because we both had read a lot of books,
Yeah.
and the rest of our players sometimes hadn't, so they wouldn't catch like references. And be like, what we should do is like make a book club where we read things that we think are really cool to read, and
Yeah.
everyone can like pitch in, so we have like a common basis of reference, a base of reference for like when we play games and stuff as well, because like suddenly everyone has read, I think I read Snow Crash before he did, and he read Neuromancer before I did, and stuff like that. So we
Cool.
started like that book club at the time. And then
Wow. That sounds like an awesome experience. Having that
yeah,
yeah.
it was a time like, playing like D&D until like 5 a.m, drinking like tons of black tea or whatever at the time, and debating. I started like, I went to university with him as well. I mean, he wasn't studying at the time, but we asked to go to like a Sumerian language class because we read Snow Crash, and we're like, I want to be a neurolingual hacker. I got to learn Sumerian, and my university is teaching Sumerian.
Oh, that's so cool.
Let's go and do Sumerian for a year.
That is so cool, actually. I love it. Yeah, that's awesome. So when did Malazan come into the picture then?
Through Black Company, I went the other way.
Okay.
So I can't really remember how I started reading Black Company. I don't know. So I read Black Company. I really enjoyed it. And I was talking with a friend at university who just like found A Song of Ice and Fire. So that was like in 2003, I think.
Okay.
For something like that. And he had found A Song of Ice and Fire and passed it on to me. And I'm like, wow, this is awesome. And then I went and read Black Company, and as I said, I have no idea how I ended up reading Black Company. And I talked to him. He's like, yeah, I've heard about this book called Malazan, which is supposedly very similar to Black Company,
Okay.
and influenced by Black Company. And I really wanted to read it, but it wasn't available in audio. So I had read Black Company like 2 or 3 times by the time audiobooks of the Malazan Book of the Fallen finally came out, and then I was like, finally I can read this. And
nice.
it was all I expected, and way more. And I'm very happy. But on the other hand, I'm also very thankful that I read Black Company first.
Yeah, you did it in the right order, actually. I actually did too. I actually read Black Company before Malazan.
And I feel like it's something that I've like struggled with. I'm doing like a Black Company read along with my channel now, and
oh, nice.
Yeah, because for me, reading Black Company feels like coming home every time. That first book, that first part in Beryl, the dual city stuff. Yeah, but a lot of people that start like our Malazan fans and read like the recommendations that Stephen Erickson has given.
Yeah.
Go and try and read Black Company and are disappointed that it's not the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Yeah,
like,
well, nothing is Malazan Book of the Fallen except Malazan.
Of course not, but that's the point. Like every book and every writer is unique. Not even the Carcanis trilogy is the Malazan Book of the Fallen, even though I would argue that the Carcanis trilogy is much closer to what I would say is Stephen Erickson's like heart. His heart really hangs on the Carcanis trilogy from where I like how I read it.
Yeah, I actually agree with you. I don't know what he would say, but I've conjectured in a similar way before, saying that I might have said even in my reviews of the 2 published Carcanis books that I feel like this is quintessentially Stephen Erickson. So yeah, I agree. I kind of agree. Maybe he would say, no, you guys, sorry. but I tend to think that Carcanis is what Stephen Erickson would write or did write just because that's what he wants to write,
Yeah.
But
which I guess is why, it always comes across that he's a bit more disappointed that Carcanis didn't sell well or didn't get that, because that's what I mean. It's like, it's where his heart seems to be, is like Carcanis. It's the tragedy of the Theist people.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant stuff, in my opinion.
I love it. That whole battle in Fall of Light.
Fall of Light. Oh my goodness.
And the way he does the battle without showing you the actual battle and doing it through
with the boy and the old man. Yeah.
That's brilliant. I love that.
It's genius. It's really just genius. It's so good. I will sing the praises of Carcanis, and I'm so excited for Walk in Shadow.
I can't wait. I really hope we'll get like a first look at the Calorian Empire, because I feel like theorizing
we're going there. Yeah.
I mean, it feels like Erastus and Setchel are. This is like full spoiler, obviously. Like, it feels like those two are going over to the Calorian Empire, and there might be a situation. I mean, I'm guessing right now that like Setchel and the Errant play a part in why the Calorian Empire falls down. It feels like the kind of thing that someone like Erastus would do. Yeah,
well, that's more speculation than spoiler, I would say, at this point.
Yeah, it's very much speculation. No one knows. I mean,
but you could very well be right, though, and I'm so excited for that book. So yeah, and of course, I'm pretty into the other thing he's writing, because he's writing like 3 or 4 books right now. So I'm also very excited for the second part of The God Is Not Willing.
Witness. The
Witness trilogy. Witness trilogy. God's Not Willing is the first book, of course. So I mean, there's exciting things coming for Malazan fans, and also Ian Esselmont is going to be coming out with 4.
I am so looking forward to the Gestalt. It's like I'm a huge Esselmont fan, Cam Esselmont fan.
Me too.
It's like I love all of his books, and I'm always trying to sing the praises of those books. I love them all, especially Blood and Bone and Assail are fantastic novels. You haven't read Assail yet, right?
I haven't. So when AP and I
you're gonna love this one.
I've been told, and
it's got all the Nordic things you love.
So Ian Esselmont actually told me, because I had done a video with AP on one of his poems from Orb, Scepter, Throne, which was very clearly inspired by Old English poetry. And I said in that video, I feel like Ian Esselmont put this poem in here just for me, because I'm an Old English guy. And I actually had written my master's thesis on the same poem, The Wanderer, that was clearly the inspiration for this Esselmont poem. So Ian Esselmont had seen that video, and he said, well, if you think I wrote that poem for you, then you're going to love Assail. And I think absolutely right. I'm so excited for it. It's the only Malazan book I haven't read yet, actually. So and I'm doing it's
brilliant.
I like you, I am a huge Esselmont fan, and I just feel like these are brilliant books in and of themselves. I believe that Esselmont belongs in the conversation when we're talking about the very greatest fantasy writers of today. And I also feel like I get so much more even out of, say, Malazan Book of the Fallen after having read the Esselmont stuff. I feel like they do enrich each other beautifully,
because you get like different perspectives, and even different perspectives on the same characters. The things Cam Esselmont does with Lacine in particular are fantastic.
And you mentioned Kalor, and
Kalor definitely, and for me personally, Taishran.
I mean, what we get are hints that maybe we don't know Kalor like we thought we did in Blood and Bone, and that will, I'm sure you're right, that when Erickson finishes Walk in Shadow, we're going to get a even fuller picture of what was hinted at in Blood and Bone. But it's so neat how these different series just absolutely feed into each other. It's such a comprehensive, I don't think there's anything like Malazan, that these two people created together this world, gamed it, and all these interweaving series that are brilliant in and of themselves, but also enrich each other. I mean, is there anything else like that?
I mean, there have been like shared world stories and stuff like that, but they're usually different, and oftentimes maybe Wild Cards. I don't know because I haven't read Wild Cards, but as far as I know, the Wild Cards like shared world superhero thing, which I'm not like a huge fan of. In like I'm not socialized with comic books, so Wild Cards doesn't interest me that much. But as far as I know, it started as a role-playing game that George R. R. Martin and some other people were playing at the time.
Okay, cool. Huh.
So there might be something there, but I haven't read it, so I can't say.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So A Sail is the only Malazan book I have left. AP and I are going to be doing Dust of Dreams actually pretty soon, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And then it'll be Crippled God and then A Sail. And very, very excited for it. Also kind of sad because I think you can identify. I remember when you finished your Malazan read and your last.
All of it in 1 year.
Yeah, you were more timely than we were, or than we have been. So, but it's just so. It is my favorite series of all time, and I never thought I would have anything surpass Lord of the Rings. So it was kind of it was a slow thing for me to admit.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I do feel that Malazan is very important because it tells us what fantasy can do in ways that I think, it tells us directions that we can go. It sort of opens doors, I think, for hopefully. And I know that Stephen Erickson has sort of in a conversation once with him and AP, he sort of despaired that Malazan would have much influence at all beyond, the people who love and adore the series, but in terms of other fantasy writers and that sort of thing. I hope was wrong about that. I think that it's a series that is increasingly being recognized for the work of genius that it is. And hopefully will have more, I think, influence outside of itself.
I think the important thing with Malazan and what makes it so special, I mean, it's not like unique in that regard, but apart from like, it being like all of it, like both Esselman's parts and Erickson's parts written and notes are like brilliantly written by people that know how to use language and stuff. But what makes it stand out for me is that, people write for different reasons. There's people that are storytellers. They want to tell you a fun story, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But with someone like Stephen Erickson, and I guess at least to the same degree with Ken Esselman as well, those people write stories to also change the world. That's like their medium to make you think about your own world and go out and be a better human being afterwards.
Yes.
And that's something that I personally, because it's like something people will probably recognize when they watch my channel. So like, I'm a very political person. I always look for these like influences that like fantasy books have on our real life, our world, what we do afterwards when we go and read those books, what they want to do with our life. And Stephen Erickson is one of those writers where you can feel that he writes these stories to tell you a great story, but also to make you think and be a better human being and make the world a better place.
I totally agree with you. And what I like about that is it's similar to what I try to do when I teach, actually, is I don't want to tell my students what to think. I want to encourage them to think. And I feel like Erickson does something similar with his writing. He doesn't tell us, he's trying to tell us, think about this stuff, look at it from all these perspectives.
Yeah.
He doesn't tell us, come down from on high and say, be compassionate, right? He instead, I think, explores compassion in various ways in order to get us to think about it. And that, I think, is absolutely, I agree with you. Literature can, not all literature must, but this is something that literature can do. And I think it's brilliant. I think it's a very important function of storytelling is to get us to think about the world we live in and can we be better in it?
I think it's something that we often forget with fantasy. It's something that we usually like when we talk about the so-called genre fictions, like usually like science fiction is about like how the world could be. Yeah. But fantasy could just as well be about how the world could be. I just like read on my train rides yesterday and today, I read The Tangled Lands by Paolo Bacigalupi and Tobias Buchel. And I don't know if you're familiar with Paolo Bacigalupi.
No, not yet.
He's a science fiction writer mostly. And He wrote The Wind-Up Girl, which is insanely good still, I think, and The Water Knife. So he deals a lot with like climate change and the way capitalism and globalization are, working or not working, depending on where in the world you live and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they both like wrote this like shared world things, like each of them wrote like two novellas that like are all set in the same setting and like interact with each other, and it goes in a similar direction because the idea there is that magic is readily available and everyone can use magic, but whenever you use magic, it attracts this like growth of brambles, of like poisonous bramble that like covers the land and is hard to fight back and will slowly kill the entire land. And everyone is always like, of course we don't use magic, but I have this one specific need where I should just like once, and then it's excusable, and it goes from there. And it's fairly easy to see what kind of allegories you can use there to the despair of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yes, poor Tolkien. Call it a metaphor, I don't know, but yeah.
But it does explore these like aspects of like how we deal with stuff where we know it's technically bad, but just once it's fine to burn more carbon or whatever you want to do as an allegory, right?
Yeah.
And it was like just really interesting to read in that regard.
Sounds like a great read and a challenging read. In other words, it challenges you to reflect on your own behavior as well, which is a good thing in my book.
Yeah. I mean, that's like one of the things I guess I've learned to like, when I think like what I really appreciate in books is usually to try to find what they teach me, what they make me think, what the big themes are. And I like to be challenged in books. Books that don't challenge me easily bore me in a way.
Yeah.
And challenge doesn't mean to be, doesn't need to be something where I'm like really have to question my inner being or whatever. It can be all kinds of small things, but there has to be something to it that is, more than just a fun story at this point.
Yeah, cool. Well, I certainly feel like I found that in Malazan.
Malazan certainly does that, yes.
Yeah. And there are a few other series that I want to get to that I feel like are going to deliver on that score. For example, you mentioned Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. That's what I'm going to be reading probably late this year. I think it depends on how things go, but definitely, if not late this year, then early next. And I also do want to read R. Scott Baker's
Prince of Nothing.
Yeah.
I wanted to read that as well. Like, I really want to go back and actually read Stephen Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, because I tried to read them right after I read Lord of the Rings, and I certainly was not like an experienced enough reader to actually see what he's trying to do there.
I actually want to do the same thing. I would like to go back and read the Thomas Covenant books. I read
Gene Wolfe. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And with Gene Wolfe, I'm pretty sure you will really love it, but maybe, I mean, Book of the New Sun is what like everyone is hyping right now, and rightly so. It's a fantastic series.
Yeah.
But for you personally, I think you might really enjoy The Wizard and the Knight. It's like 2-book series, so I guess duology, maybe something like that, Cool. And it's 2 books, and it's more about Arthurian and Norse mythology.
Neat. Yeah, The Wizard and the Knight sounds really
and it's like Gene Wolfe always does the same thing. So usually with Gene Wolfe, you get like first person, very unreliable narrator. It's what you get with Book of the New Sun. It's what you get with Wizard and Knight. It's what you get with Latro. There's like Roman soldier in Greece with amnesia and who may or may not meet gods. It's kind of difficult to say. And it's what you get in even like his more mundane stuff like The Land Across, which is really fascinating read about like some weird East European country that may or may not exist, and someone getting almost like trapped in this almost Kafkaesque kind of bureaucracy and stuff.
Wow.
And but it's always the same. You can tell it like Gene Wolfe book after like the first couple of like sentences, if you're like familiar with his writing. But he's probably the most deliberate writer that I've ever read. Like with Book of the New Sun, it's insane to see how deliberately he like deals with reader expectation, manipulates reader expectation. There's like not a single word in that entire book that is not there for like a very specific purpose.
Wow. Huh.
That's something that a lot of fantasy like writers, not all, but like a lot of fantasy writers are more like storytellers, and
Right.
prose comes second to like the really cool story with a lot of writers. With Gene Wolfe, those two things are like very heavily intertwined in a lot of ways.
So he sounds like a real wordsmith. Yeah.
He's a wordsmith, and the way he, as I said, like the way he directs like reader expectation is absolutely fascinating. And the way he just tells you what he's going to do in the next 4 books in like the first chapter. And then you're still surprised when he does it, and then you go and reread it and you're like, oh, blast, that's what he meant. And he even tells you at the end of the books, like, yeah, if there are inconsistencies in here, you should probably go and read it again. He has the balls to tell the reader, like, if you didn't get it, maybe read it again. And he's right.
Yeah. Sounds
that level of confidence is fantastic and fascinating. And looking at the whole thing being written in like 3 years in like the early 80s, it's like, it is very unique in that regard.
That's amazing. Yeah. Wow. Cool. Well, I'll definitely be checking that out. That is a priority, but I'll be reading after AP and I finish Malazan. The next big series that I'll be reading is going to be Jenny Wurtz's Wars of Light and Shadow. So I'm really excited.
I always wanted to read that, but it's not available in Audible.
Not
an
available.
audiobook form for me, except book 10. I can get book 10 on Audible. The rest is not available in my region, at least.
Okay, that's sort of not helpful, right?
No, it's very much not helpful.
Why would they make book 10 available but not 1 through 9?
It's the weirdness of publishing and licensing deals, and I guess AP can tell you way more about it than I can. I can just like I can just tell you about the downside of it, which is that I can get for John Gwynne, an author that I know you really like.
I love John Gwynne's books. Yeah, I know you don't so much. Yeah.
No, well, for The Faithful and the Fallen, I can only get the final book of the trilogy.
Really?
In Audible, yes.
Well, it's 4 books, but yeah.
The like it's Wrath or something like that. That one I can get.
That's the 4th book. Yeah.
I can get Wrath, and the rest are like unavailable in my region.
That's terrible.
They exist, but they're like region locked to the US.
So could somebody? So how, you have to assume I'm completely ignorant about audiobooks. So I couldn't buy that for you here and send it to you in any way?
Not in a legal way.
Oh, okay. Not in a legal way.
Not in a legal way.
They don't sell them as like CDs or anything anymore?
Yeah, they don't anymore. Like usually that's where like the digital era, where we basically only rent properties, right? Like we pay Audible and we pay them, like if you use Audible, you pay for an audiobook.
Right.
But it's always on their server, and they can yank that whenever they feel like it.
So it's better to have a CD, but they don't make it.
It is better to have CDs in that regard. And yes, with the CD, I could just order it in the US and like pay import tax, and then I have it.
Right.
But with like digital, that's no longer possible. And
that's a real downside to digital, then, isn't it? Wow.
It certainly is. And so there's a bunch of things that I would love to read or listen to that I can't right now. I'm really pissed off about Elric. So there's finally like a new Elric edition, like omnibus, like 3-volume. It's like Elric, Stormbringer, whatever the third one is. Okay. And the first one is on Audible, and the second one will come out on Audible next week, but apparently only in the US. So I can't get the second one. If I can have the first one.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That just doesn't seem right. That's gonna be like torture, you know?
It is annoying. It is very annoying, is what it is.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
I'm nothing if not polite. Well,
yeah.
So, but what I'm going to read next, I think, is more Jack Vance, because he's one of my favorite authors that are so often underappreciated.
I talked about a lot on BookTube, that's for sure.
No one talks about Jack Vance, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Have you read Jack Vance, like Dying Earth?
No, I haven't, and that's another of the big gaps in my fantasy reading. So I tend to be very well read in really, really, really old stuff, And certain eras of fantasy, I'm fairly well read, but there are big gaps there. So Jack Vance is one of them. And I'll fill it someday, but I'm trying to fill other gaps first. So like David Gemmell and Gene Wolfe and all that. So but and also as you sort of just observed, I think when you're thinking about what you're going to read, and if you're a booktuber, you have to think about, if you want your channel, if that's a goal of yours, you want your channel to grow or that sort of thing. There's definitely, I think, incentive to read more recent stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah,
which is like a struggle for me because I'm fairly well read in, say, like classics of the more sword and sorcery variety, right? Like I've read a ton of Robert E. Howard. I've read a lot of Fritz Leiber. I read a lot of like Clark Ashton Smith.
Yep.
Even read some Arthur Machen.
I think there's a place for that on BookTube. I think there would definitely be people who would love to hear somebody talk about, stuff like Gormenghast, for example.
Ooh, I love Gormenghast is a fascinating book.
Yeah. So, I mean,
and it's very tough to read. We had like a discussion about that, like on like a Discord server on Iska Jarak's Unabridged Burmese Discord server a while ago. It's like how Gormenghast is something that like in academic circles is absolutely well discussed and hailed as a masterpiece. And in like pedestrian fantasy reader circles, almost no one has read Gormenghast at this point. Like, which is a shame because it's so good.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could be the person who goes out and makes it, gives it some attention, So
I don't know. I'll certainly go and read the Demon Prince series by Jack Vance now. And if you want to go and read Jack Vance, While Dying Earth is probably his like favorite, his most popular thing. Something that like might interest you specifically, Philip, is the Lyonesse trilogy, which is him playing around with Arthurian legend and things like that.
Nice. Yeah, I do like that sort of thing. Yeah.
In a more like in a typical Jack Vance kind of way. Jack Vance is like Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, Terry Pratchett is the line of humor in fantasy where irony and wordplay are huge. It's where like someone like Robert E. Howard brings the existentialism and the grittiness into fantasy, and Tolkien takes the mythology side of things. Jack Vance and Fritz Leiber, and up to a point Clark Ashton Smith, and definitely Jack Vance, are the people that bring like the humor that then gets like crystallized by someone like Terry Pratchett, who then obviously uses it for like social commentary.
Yeah, and I have read enough Terry Pratchett to know what you're talking about. So I've only read now 3 Discworld books. So that's definitely another thing I need to
He's definitely one of my absolute favorite authors. I'm like a huge Terry Pratchett fan. I've read all Discworld novels at least 3 times at this point.
Oh, that's
some
awesome.
of them way more often.
Wow. Yeah, so I've only read the first 2. What are they? The Color of Magic and
The Light Fantastic.
And then I read Guards. And I thought that Guards was fantastic.
The Light Fantastic is an interesting book for what it does in The Color of Magic, because it's Terry Pratchett trying out to do slapstick, and like early Terry Pratchett is way more self-referential when it comes to the fantasy genre. Like when you read The Color of Magic and you have that scene when they ride out of the town, like how it's how the first part is framed, and the 2 people that are standing there, which is Brav, the Hoplander, and the Weasel, they're clearly like a parody of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser from Fritz Leiber's Lankmar stories.
There's also a Conan parody in there.
Yeah, of course. There's several Conan parodies in there. So a lot of the early Pratchett is very much parody and humor targeted again, like at the fantasy genre and the role-playing games and the fantasy literature genre. And then later on, he moves more towards satirizing or like general social commentary, which is sort of what you see in Guards, and like in later books even more.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, I definitely need to read more Pratchett as well. So glad I'm talking to you about this stuff. You're giving me some good stuff that I'm going to be reading in the future. That's for sure. But I'm curious about German fantasy because I
Mhm.
have read a little bit. I've read, for example, Bernhard Hennen's The Elven,
And oh yeah.
which is, well, I enjoyed it actually, and I did not continue yet. I can read German, but it's very tortuously slow when I do.
Yeah.
But
Um,
only the three of those have been translated into English.
so Bernhard Henn is connected to like the German tabletop role-playing game Das Schwarze Auge.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's translated in English into the dark eye because someone realized that the black eye might have like unfortunate
Oh,
connotations.
getting punched in the eye. Yeah.
Yeah, but and it's like a German like Dungeons and Dragons clone, and Bernhard Henn wrote books in that subset. I'm not very well read in German fantasy. There's one book that I always tell people to read, which is Stein und Flöte, or Stone and Flute in English.
Yeah.
I think it's translated into English, and it has like in German it's called ein Märchenroman, like a fairy tale novel.
Okay. Yeah.
And it uses a lot more like the imagery of the fairy tale and the fable, and you have talking animals and things like that, and it's a very unique thing, and it does not, because a lot of German fantasy tries to replicate the more American side of fantasy, the more.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And that one is very unique German in a way.
Yeah, because I mean, you have such a rich history of fantastic, in a broader sense, literature in Germany that you can draw upon, that I would think that a lot of modern authors would use that for inspiration or even refer to it. Or does that not happen so much?
Well, there's a general issue with the German traditions, which is we had this thing going on in the 1930s, and to put it mildly. So the interesting thing is that during the Nazi regime in the 30s and 40s,
right,
who tried to like very clearly define what German culture is, what German identity is.
Yep.
And, obviously it goes back to like the 19th century Romantic era.
Of course.
The idea of like the building of a German nation state, which is where the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm come in. But the point I'm trying to get at is that after all of that, a lot of like German traditional things in Germany, folk music, poetry, a lot of stuff that was just like completely burnt in a way, because you can't touch that stuff now, because it was like it's basically what you get when you're talking about like Richard Wagner. Is like, are those fantastic operas? Hell yeah. But
they are.
Can you watch a Richard Wagner opera today? Can you watch The Ring of the Nibelungs without the context of the Nazi?
Well, I mean, Wagner, as much as he had some horrendous beliefs himself.
Holy shit, that guy was definitely.
But he did not know that the Nazi Party would be a thing.
No, of course. But it's very difficult to come back from that, like use a lot of like the Norse mythology and those things, because they are so much tainted by it. It's very, very difficult to recover that. Say what happens.
It's a really interesting. I'm glad you brought this up, because I hope that there will come a time when in Germany you can re-embrace some of the older material that somehow got stained because they were celebrated by Nazis. But they existed before Nazis, and to sort of, I guess, appropriate them from that. To take them away from that might be, and I'm not saying I know when and how that should happen, but maybe there will come a time when it will feel right and natural to do that, where you can take, Viking stuff and you can write modern fantasy in German based on, I don't know, whatever, the Nibelungenlied or whatever, and that it won't seem like there's that miasma from the Nazis having made that so central to their identity, because I would hate to cede all of that beautiful stuff to those kinds of people, right? I mean,
yeah, definitely. But I mean, the problem there is the Romantic movement is already like on that in that direction. And it's not
it
a
is.
German thing
It
in general,
absolutely is. That's true.
because
Yeah.
a lot of like the Romantic movement and folklore studies of the time are, because it's like the 19th century, right? We're trying to, a lot of like nation states are like founded, and you can quote me on this. I think the idea of the nation state is a problem in general, but
Yeah.
so a lot of that is motivated in that direction. Like one of the things that, like, I don't know how many people are aware of that abroad, but like the Brothers Grimm with the fairy tales, like their big thing they actually did, apart from collecting fairy tales, was to write the first German dictionary, the dictionary of the German language, to collect, to define what is German, because at the time, like, Germany is one of the countries in Europe that was like one of the last countries to become a nation state of like Central, like Western Europe, together with Italy. So a lot of the stuff you see in the 19th century,
1870s or so.
Exactly. Like you have the movement like 1884, like 48, with the like sort of revolution, like a first idea, like maybe some radically democratic movement, and that gets like squashed really quickly, and then you go all the way back. But that's like when you define, when people try to come up with like a German identity, a German nationality. And that's when you take folk tales and fairy tales and mythologies and bind them into something, say this is German, and no longer just like your regional thing. And when you go back and you go over to, say, across the Baltic and look to Finland, for example, that's where Elias Lönnrot went and collect the Kalevala to define a Finnish national epos, which is very much connected with the idea of like a Finland or a Finnish identity, a national identity. And a lot of that stuff happens at the time. So it's always difficult to take these, what we call folk tales and folk traditions in a lot of cases, and like completely separate them from that impetus to create a national identity, because you need to go beyond that. You need to go back to like actual sources in like the 16th, 15th and earlier centuries, basically.
Right. No, it's a fascinating subject, because you're absolutely right that Romanticism, as much as there are some very beautiful aspects to Romanticism, it is also very much tied with nationalism and the rise of it in the 19th century. And it's no accident that fantasy as a genre is really, as a modern genre, is born in the 19th century with writers like George MacDonald and William Morris. And William Morris particularly, I wrote my dissertation on William Morris. So this is all very relevant, because the very language that he used in his fantasies, which they called prose romances in the 1890s, he developed this language. This is kind of the heart of my dissertation. He developed this fantasy language in the process of translating Icelandic sagas. And he did that with a partner, an Icelandic fellow named Eiríkur Magnússon. And the two of them did these translations. You can see in the manuscripts of the translations how Magnússon would usually, the norm was for Magnússon to do a translation, then Morris would go over it and change it. And almost inevitably, Morris would Germanicize the translation, meaning he would heavily favor words that had German or Germanic roots, because Old English is a Germanic language, but because of the unique history of English, it has a lot of French and Latin loanwords. So,
do you know this fantastic quote from H.B. Piper, the sci-fi like science fiction writer, about the English language?
Yeah, what is it?
It's like the English language is the result of Viking warriors trying to pick up English barmaids by using French, and it is no more legitimate than any other offspring of that attempt.
Yeah, I've also heard something about French being essentially Italian mangled by Germans.
True.
But anyway, so Morris would go over these and would Germanicize them. And there was a whole philosophy behind this. It wasn't just an aesthetic choice. Morris believed, along with a lot of other people, that the the Germanic Old English culture of England was a far more communal and egalitarian society. Morris actually became a socialist. He believed in this communalism to the degree that he became a socialist. Most medievalists in the 19th century were actually reactionary, and were basically trying to reassert a kind of hierarchy where the feudal overlords would, in a symbiotic relationship with the masses, would take care of them in exchange for absolute loyalty and blah, blah, blah. So it's very idealized. But Morris recognized that, as a lot of Hui, and embraced socialism, and became a very strong advocate for socialism. But interestingly, he too associated the Germanic with egalitarianism, in contrast to Romance words, in other words, French and Latin, which he associated with hierarchy, with urbanness as well. This is something that Tolkien, by the way, inherits in a big way. The Romance stuff, the French and the Latin, being more associated with not only hierarchy, but with urbanness, as opposed to the Germanic, which is more associated with rural and egalitarian. And it's all very, there's a whole part of this where you have historians in England in the 19th century feeding this narrative about the native Germanic tendency toward democracy and egalitarianism and so on and so forth. So it is very much all these things in the 19th century are very much tied together. Romanticism, nationalism, national identity, ideas about politics, and it unfortunately takes a very, very dark turn when it comes to the development of the Nazis. But you had stuff like that going on in places like England as well.
Yeah, of course, it's all over the place. Like one of my favorite like contemporary authors on that regard is like Lavi Tidar from Israel. Although he lives in England, and he's written like he's currently writing like a series of books he calls The Antimatter of Britain. Where he takes like what is called the matter of Britain and writes contemporary novels on it. And if you have the time, I would highly recommend you go and read By Force Alone and The Hood, which are like his deconstructions, very, very angry deconstructions of like the Arthurian legends and the myths of Robin Hood. And he wrote like an entire book that I personally, it's one of those hard books that really challenged me in a lot of ways. It's called A Man Lies Dreaming. And it's very much deals with nationalism and the rise of fascism in England in the 30s.
Yep. And here in the United States too, of course.
Lindbergh.
yeah, we had our Charles Lindberghs as well.
Certainly one of my favorite books of from last year was The Hood by Lavi Tidar. Like because he's someone who tries to, once again, like what you said earlier, is like to show what is possible within the field of fantasy fiction in a way. And Lavi Tidar is certainly someone who does a lot in that regard for me as well. Cameron Hurley does a lot of that in a more like angry feminist like way. And someone I recently read is Brian Catling. He wrote the Vor trilogy about like colonialism in Africa and fantasy. And recently last year, he wrote something called The Hollow, or it's just called Hollow. And it deals with Hieronymus Bosch and like Flemish paintings and the religious background behind that, and try to translate that into fiction. So it's very grotesque in a lot of ways, and like deals a lot like with the like how to translate specific imagery from like a graphic medium, like which is painting in that regard, into a written medium like a novel. And he obviously goes and puts in some fun references to Borges and the Library of Babel as well, which is always right, because you cannot reference Borges enough.
Neat. Wow, that is so cool. So Raf, you're obviously very, very well read, and that is one of the things I like about you. I'm curious, because a lot of us who are active here on this platform are also people who aspire to write. And I'm curious about you. And do you have aspirations to write?
No,
Did you ever think about that?
no.
Not at all.
I guess mostly because I don't have the patience. It's one of those like mental health issues. It's like I am diagnosed with ADHD, and I just don't have the patience to sit down and write, much less actually reread what I've written and go through it in like an editing process. I just can't. It's why I'm struggling so much with like actually writing a PhD thesis, which is something that I'm supposed to do, but I don't, because I'm struggling hard with it because of those kind of things. Like, I'm a very I'm a very passionate person, and I'm a very spontaneous person. It's like with my YouTube content, it's the same thing. It's like I have an idea, and if I don't sit down and record the video right this moment, even if I write down my ideas and I go back the next day and I look at the idea and I'm like, nah, it's probably not that good, and I won't do it. It has to be in that moment, and that's not something that lends itself to writing stories, because that's like a slow craft, and you go and read, or you write it, and you rewrite it, and you edit it, and you go over it again and again and again.
This is true.
I don't have the patience. Although
that's more, back in the day when you had to use a quill and vellum or whatever, or even paper and ink. Revision was probably not as thorough as it is today. But nowadays, you're absolutely right. I don't even know how many times I've revised my writing. It just, I've lost track, really. I mean, so many times. And I actually weirdly enjoy that part the most. So I love going over my writing and tweaking and I hope making it better in the process. So that
I don't have the patience for that. And like, I'm literally with like reading my own things. It's the same kind of weirdness that you have, like a lot of us have, when listening to our voice when it's recorded. It always feels slightly strange. You have that always like slight estrangement there. And
so
I have the same thing when I'm reading.
It makes you very self-conscious.
Yeah, exactly. I have the same thing when I'm reading what I've written, and it's not a good thing. It's like I usually when I write like an academic text or whatever, I sit down and write it front to back in one go, and then I usually ask someone else who's good with like spelling and stuff to go over it and tell me what I did wrong, and then it's done. I don't revise. I'm not good with that.
Okay, so if it's not too painful a question, may I ask, what are you writing your dissertation about?
If I ever finish it, it's a philosophy of religion.
Cool. Wow.
And it's about English deism in the 17th century, and trying to compare it to current positions in analytic philosophy of religion.
Wow, that actually sounds very interesting.
It's all about like how we can get knowledge about the nature of God, and what are like legitimate sources for knowledge in that regard. Whether it's like something we can deduce from the world that we live in, or whether we should go and whether divine revelation is the only approach we have to actually gain knowledge of the nature of God. Because 17th century, everyone is sort of agreeing that God exists, but you want to know more than just the guy exists. You want to know how to live your life, and the question is like, where do you get that information, like how to live a good life, and can you do that by looking at the world or not? Because if reading it, like having divine revelation, the Bible, for example, in the Christian context, is the only option you have. What about all those poor people living in all kinds of parts of the world that have no access to Christianity at the time? Are all of those people condemned to hell? Is that the case or not? And all
the people who lived before Christianity, there's been a lot.
I mean, those people. That's why Virgil is like loitering outside of hell, right? Because he can't go into heaven. Poor bastard.
Poor Virgil.
And it's tied, like politically, it's tied to like a more democratic movement in like the 17th century and like early 18th century in England. Like the movement of the dissenters that are trying to democratize, is that the word, democratize religion in a way, and take it away from the like
Yep.
position of power that the High Church in England has. So it's
Yep.
connected to that, and plays a huge role in during the Glorious Revolution. And people like John Locke and John Toland are
Yep.
sort of people that are into that kind of thing. So
Yeah. Oh,
that's something that I sometimes read for, not for fun, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a big connection to the American Revolution, of course, too, because
Yeah.
a lot of our quote unquote founding fathers were deists themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of that philosophy comes into play when it comes to the justifications for the American Revolution as well. So, yeah.
Definitely. So, yeah.
Wow, it sounds really cool. So when you finish, you'll have a PhD in philosophy.
Yes. If I finish, I'll have a PhD in philosophy, although I actually have my master's degree in computer science.
Oh, wow, that is so cool.
Yeah, I'm all over the place.
Yeah, I mean,
I've also studied a lot of like ancient and medieval history.
nice. Well, you know, I approve of that, of course.
Yeah.
So.
And I will always read Herodotus before reading Thucydides. It's way more fun.
Yeah, definitely.
It's got the ants that dig gold, and that's all you need to know, and the story of the phoenix.
Yeah. Beautiful. Wow. So I didn't know about the computer science, actually. So is that something you use at all these days, or?
No.
Okay.
I haven't done it for a long time. I did my master's thesis on aspects of artificial intelligence.
Oh, cool. So that's almost philosophy too, though, isn't it?
It can slip over into that area, yes.
Yeah.
And I'm very like interested like in philosophy, also in like philosophy of literature and things like that, and how you like what we can maybe learn from literature, what knowledge we can get from art. Are there like forms of knowledge we can get from art that are specific to art that other forms of culture cannot provide? Is there something like that?
Wow.
Those are questions that I'm like personally very interested in. I mean we both agree on that. We've spoken about that before, that
yeah. Have you read,
thing
sorry, I was going to ask you, because everything you're saying to me makes me think of a certain book, and I'm guessing that you heard of it, but it's Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid.
I have not read it. I know that Terry Pratchett quotes it a lot in his Science of Discworld novels, though.
Okay, so that's my recommendation today for you is Gödel, Escher, Bach. And Hofstadter was a computer scientist.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that in this book. It's almost impossible to say what this book is, except that it is about consciousness.
Yeah.
And the nature of consciousness.
Mm.
And he incorporates, you can tell from the title, Gödel was a mathematician.
Of course.
Escher, Escher, the artist, of course. And Bach. And what they all have in common are these loops. So in their various realms.
The circularity you find in Stephen Erickson's prose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I should ask him if he's read Gödel, Escher, Bach, but it's a weird book because I find that very few people reference it. It's a fascinating book. It was written in the 1970s. Yeah. And I find that it's a book that could have been vastly influential, but it seems like almost no one ever references.
Yeah.
And I don't know quite why. Maybe it's because it's just so different and hard to categorize. Maybe. But he had some fascinating ideas about the nature of consciousness related to these loops, actually. Strange loops. I think you would find it a very interesting read.
I know I will. As I said, like Terry Pratchett has this like series, like 3 or 4 books called The Science of Discworld, that he wrote together with like a couple of scientist friends. So there's like one chapter is about like one specific aspect of like natural science, and then there's like another chapter of like a Discworld novel where Discworld characters encounter something that is related to that chapter and so forth, and it goes on and on like that. And the story is not too too involved for a Discworld novel, but it's one of those things like, but where Terry Pratchett is very much like Stephen Erickson. Terry Pratchett wants to change the world with his writing. Yeah, he's someone who looks at the world and is not happy, and then he writes a book to make it better.
Yeah, quite a few books actually.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And there's like a wonderful essay after the death of Terry Pratchett, when Neil Gaiman wrote an essay, I think in The Guardian or something. It's called "Terry Pratchett is not jolly, he's angry," which
Oh,
is very much
wow.
about the fact that Terry Pratchett has this reputation of being this funny old, like jolly old gentleman.
And
And
harmless. Yeah.
yeah, and Neil Gaiman's like, no, literally, like it's anger at the world and at the universe that has driven Terry Pratchett to write the books he wrote,
Wow. Wow.
which is something that I personally really approve, because I'm an angry person most of the time.
Yeah, we won't talk about Wheel of Time. Yeah. So,
It's a long story. I'm
yeah,
glad I'm glad I have read it. I'm glad I'm done with it, but I'm also glad I have finally actually read it, because it's like the last like big influential fantasy series outside of Harry Potter that was missing in my general like.
just yeah. I mean, it is big and it's influential for
Yeah,
sure. Just to warn you, if you're watching this and you're a big time Wheel of Time fan, and it's very difficult for you to hear criticism of Wheel of Time, don't watch Raf's videos on Wheel of Time, please.
no. I have been, and I'm well aware that I at some point certainly did choose the least charitable reading of some parts of the series. I'm aware of that, and
Yeah, yeah,
mostly I'm just like annoyed or angry, because there are some really good ideas in there, and I just feel
yeah,
the Wheel of Time could have been absolutely stunning and fascinating
yeah.
if it was written by a more talented writer, edited by someone who actually did their job and
Uh-huh.
executed better. Because
Yeah.
there's a lot of like annoying like editing errors where I'm like, why did no one pick up on that? There's inconsistencies there that could have been solved, no problem. That's a job that like of like a publisher. But I feel the problem is Wheel of Time got too big.
Yeah,
It's
I
like,
do. I do think, and I'm actually a fan of the series. I've said
mm,
many times I like
yeah,
the series. I recognize it has flaws, and one of them is it's too long. I think it would have been a better series if it had been about 5 books shorter, maybe.
mm,
But I also agree with you about some of the editing. I actually think Jordan is a talented writer. I would call him in some ways a, sort of uneven, but that he has moments of real brilliance, and
he does.
his writing can be very poetic at times. I like
He's
his prose.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's very strong, and unfortunately it's like an underused aspect of the series. But
Uh,
like, I mean, Robert E. Howard, like he started out writing Conan pastiches. When you start
yes.
reading
Yeah.
the early Wheel of Time books, Eye of the World,
Yeah.
it feels like someone with the prose and the prose style of the 30s. Because when you look at how Howard or Lovecraft and those people wrote
Right.
prose, they use a lot of adjectives, front loading things. Like their sentences are usually something, adjective, 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 noun.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's something that Jordan takes over into the beginning of the Wheel of Time starts out with, if Robert E. Howard had written The Shire. That's
Yeah.
how the Two Rivers feel to me.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
and I'm fine with that. That's good, and he's really strong when he does what you might call cosmic horror or horror in general. His
Uh-huh.
scenes in, say, Shadar Logoth with like the fog, or in the ways with Machin Shin, or the wind, the bodiless wind that like eats
Yeah.
people and stuff. That stuff is fascinating. Even later, there's like a scene in Crossroads of Twilight, I guess, when they come into this town where people are seeing the dead walking again, and that
Uh-huh.
whole scene, the atmosphere and the horror is really, really good. And then he just goes and just does something terrible, and I get pissed off again.
Well, I guess we will talk about Wheel of Time.
No,
Uh,
I feel it has a lot of like strong ideas. The
yes.
execution is unfortunately uneven, as you said,
Yeah.
and it has aged terribly bad.
Uh-huh.
It
Yeah, there
like,
are aspects of it that it's very binary, for example, in that sense, maybe. But it I do think that there are some still, it's worth reading. I would tell people who are interested in fantasy and you want to know about a very important work in the genre.
Yeah.
I do think it's worth
I
reading.
think I think what it's a bridge between Tolkien influence
Yes,
fantasy and grimdark.
I
It's basic.
agree. I agree.
It's basically someone who has like enjoyed Tolkien and likes what Ted Williams is doing,
Yep.
but also recognizes the problem and is halfway towards Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones is like the book that
Yep.
kind of brings the grimdark and the fast pace. It's I think like Game of Thrones and the follow-ups, like Song of Ice and Fire, have been vastly influential,
Yes.
not only because of the darkness, and there's a lot of like terrible stuff going on in Game of Thrones, and like there's like misogyny down there that you can't just like justify with it was like that in the ancient days. No, it wasn't.
No.
But
It's honestly a bit voyeuristic at times.
it is very much, and what Game of Thrones does, what George R. R. Martin brought to the fantasy genre, and it then got even more explicit with Joe Abercrombie. And it's important to know that both Abercrombie and George R. R. Martin both worked in television.
Yes.
And the way they write their stories is a very cinematic, very visual way that follows the narrative techniques of TV. It's like every chapter ends on a cliffhanger. It's very much written like a TV show, and that's like in the 90s and 2000s when we have all been socialized by television and by that form of narrative.
Yep.
That is what absolutely, that's why it's so accessible and why it was so successful is because it was easy to read. Game of Thrones is insanely easy to read, where something like Tolkien or even Ted Williams, whom I'm dragging out right now, but they feel a bit pedestrian. They're cumbersome in their prose, in their narrative style and all that. Game of Thrones is sleek. It reads extremely sleek.
I agree.
And Abercrombie takes that to 11.
Yep. Totally agree. Your assessment, in my opinion, is spot on. In terms of all the place that each of these different series has in the development of the genre, I completely agree with you. Another, I think, positive, to just leave one more positive out there for Wheel of Time is I like Jordan's influences from Eastern philosophy in there as well. And that's something that I felt like it made the series more interesting in places.
But are they really there? Because at its core, I would argue that Wheel of Time is unfortunately very much a Christian allegory. And Robert Jordan is not
major chosen one there. Yes,
you have a major chosen one. He certainly took. I mean, there's like a Dune influence there, where he didn't understand that Frank Herbert is very much writing against the white savior narrative, but Rand is exactly that, and Rand is your chosen one. And I think what he didn't get is that you have like your relative dualism.
Yeah.
And he turns it into like an absolute good and evil dualism, which is a very Christian thing to do.
This is true. Yeah.
And yes, you can argue that you have your dualism in Manichaeism and Cathar heresy and all of those.
That's where it derives from in Christianity.
Yes, but the problem there is that you have a personal creator God, and then you have the evil one, the fallen one,
right,
and so forth. And those are personal forces. And if you want those personal forces, a personal dark one or whatever, then you need to give those people motivations and stuff. It's not no longer a fundamental force driving the universe. Suddenly that guy is a guy and no longer just whatever. And that's something that he never really like reconciled in his world building.
Yeah, you're absolutely right again. So cool. Well, I mean, we've talked about quite a few series and books, and you just increased my wish list of books to read before I die. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, this has been fantastic. Is there anything else that you want to talk about while we're here together?
I mean, I think if there's one thing that I always say, and I don't always say that, but it's like what I try to do is like try to always sometimes read outside our chosen comfort zone. It's why I go into, the more like American novels, like the Thomas Pynchons, the Cormac McCarthy's and whatnot.
Nice. Yeah.
Because it helps us appreciate the things we read in fantasy and recognize when people actually do interesting things with fantasy, because it's always important to have a broader like view of the field.
Yep.
Oh, and the final thing is like everyone always should read Don Quixote, because it's probably, after Winnie the Pooh, the best novel ever written.
Nice. Okay, I love it. So read Winnie the Pooh and Don Quixote, and read richly. Read outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I would say that goes for nonfiction as well. I a lot of the things that I mentioned, good old Escher Bach.
Yes.
Things like that.
Have you, Philip, read The Golden Bough by Fraser?
Of course, yeah. I mean, yeah. I did a lot of comparative mythology when I was doing my
PhD. It's wrong in a lot of ways, but it's also
it's outdated in many ways, but it's fascinating. Yeah.
I mean that's like one of the things that I kind of regret about like academia, because we've come so far. We no longer have people that think that they can just like write this grand theory.
It's true.
And like 19th century mythology, folklore studies, anthropology, and so forth. It's wrong, but it's people that's like, I have found the answer to everything. Here's my 500-page book. And then you're like, I've learned a lot of stuff about corn demons. And that's information I will certainly use in my next Dungeons and Dragons campaign.
You are so right. I mean, I've heard Steven Erikson talk about this too, how the Renaissance person is basically gone. I mean, you just don't have people who, and that's why I like this Gödel Escher Bach thing.
It goes in that direction. You have like someone.
Oh yeah, big time. Or for example, Robert Sapolsky's book called Behave, which is about, he's a neuroscientist, but he dips into sociology, he dips into psychology, he dips into all these other realms. And then of course, you have these specialists from these other realms saying, no, you got little this fact and little that fact wrong here. So therefore your entire book is garbage now. Whereas he's trying to synthesize all this stuff, and your synthesizers are a rare breed these days. That's for sure. Yeah.
I'm always sympathetic to the people that come with the grand theory.
Yeah. No, I like that.
Which is why the White Goddess by Robert Graves is such a fascinating book. It's complete insanity, but it's great insanity when you're reading it.
Yep, this is for sure.
No one would dare to just like derive the tree alphabet of the Druids out of like a bunch of rhymes they found on like a stone somewhere in like Wales.
That's great. Yeah, I love it.
But it's important to keep those things as influences, that like the dream that we could find the answer. I think that's important there.
Beautifully said. Yeah, the dream that we could find the answer. That's what keeps us going, right? So
sometimes.
Well, Raf, I have enjoyed myself immensely here chatting with you. And like I said, you've given me some real food for thought, and I appreciate that very much. So thank you, my friend. And
thank you.
Everybody, his channel is called Raf Blutaxt. I will put, of course, there'll be a link to it in the description. And Raf is, I think we know each other through Malazan first. So I always think of you as part of the Malaztuber gang, but really your channel is very broad and, fantasy oriented, and you're as likely to talk about, Abercrombie or Jordan or George Martin or anything else, I suppose. Right?
I said I recently did talk about Thomas Pynchon, whom I absolutely adore as an author.
Nice. So you will go outside of fantasy too.
I might go and talk about Cormac McCarthy soon, because I feel more people should go and read Blood Meridian, which is the darkest thing I've ever read.
Wow, I haven't read that, but I've read The Road, and it's brilliant.
The Road is brilliant, and it's a holiday trip compared to Blood Meridian.
Oh my goodness. Okay, wow. All right. Well, I feel like that might be a challenge then.
It's an absolutely fascinating book in the way, like, McCarthy's prose, like, his super terse and short prose, right? It
Yeah.
lends itself
To a kind
to
of bleakness.
either post-apocalypse or like Western stories.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. The Road is a very bleak book. That's for sure.
Yeah,
You're telling me that it's a camping trip compared to.
it's a camping trip compared to
Okay.
that.
Wow. Okay.
But it
Well,
does interesting things once again with history and the question of like what's the nature of evil. It's very interesting in that regard.
wow. Wow. All right, cool. Well, those are all things to think about, that's for sure. So, well, thank you once again, my friend. It's
Yes.
been just a super pleasure here chatting with you and
Yeah.
having it. First time, actually, we've been able to talk to each other in a video, and hopefully we'll have many more opportunities for this. Maybe when I read Gene Wolfe, I will be coming to gather some wisdom from you.
I would love to talk about Gene Wolfe with you.
Yeah. Nice. Well, let's do that then.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
And
thank
any
you.
final words you would like to say to my viewers?
I don't know. Read more Tolkien. Read more in general.
Yeah, just read. Yeah.
And drink good beer.
Yes. All
By
right.
which I mean the beer you can afford.
Yes. Good beer, as good as you can afford. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, with those parting words of wisdom, then, thank you once again, Raf, and thank you everyone for watching. And until next time.